Bermuda Hundred was the first incorporated town in the English colony of Virginia. It was founded by Sir Thomas Dale in 1613, 6 years after Jamestown, at the southwestern edge of the confluence of the Appomattox and James Rivers opposite City Point, annexed to Hopewell, Virginia in 1923. Bermuda Hundred was a port town for many years. The terminology, Bermuda Hundred, also included a large area adjacent to the town. In the colonial era, hundreds were large developments of many acres, arising from the English term to define an area which would support 100 homesteads. The port at the town of Bermuda Hundred was intended to serve other hundreds in addition to Bermuda Hundred. The area of the peninsula between the James and Appomattox rivers on which Bermuda Hundred is located was part of the Bermuda Hundred campaign. During the American Civil War, no longer a shipping port, Bermuda Hundred is now a small community in the southeastern portion of Chesterfield County, Virginia. Establishment. The town of Bermuda Hundred was settled by the English in 1613 by Sir Thomas Dale, and was incorporated the following year. The town, described as a fishing village, was situated on the peninsula at the confluence of the Appomattox and James Rivers, southeast of Richmond, and northeast of Petersburg. Thomas Dale annexed to his new Bermuda plantation many miles of champion and woodland ground in several hundreds by the names of Nether Hundred, Shirley Hundred, and so on. Sir Thomas Dale, who served as governor of Virginia for about 3 months in 1611 and from 1614 to 1616, hoped to replace the settlement of Jamestown in a more suitable location a few miles from the town of Bermuda Hundred at Henricus. Governor Dale initially named the location across the Appomattox River from the town of Bermuda Hundred as Bermuda.It. The latter was later renamed Charles City Point, and eventually just City Point, before it was annexed by the independent city of Hopewell in 1923. Some sources indicate that Dale called the entire region New Bermuda after the island source of name. Bermuda Hundred was named for Bermuda, which became part of the Virginia colony for a few years after the shipwreck of the ill-starred Sea Venture, the new flagship of the Virginia Company of London. With most of the leaders and supplies aboard the Sea Venture, it was leading the third supply mission from England to Jamestown in 1609 when the 8 ships ran into a major storm. What was thought to be a hurricane separated them. The new caulking on the Sea Venture caused it to take on water. After the crew fought the storm and bailed water from the holds for 3 days, the admiral of the fleet, Sir George Somers, drove the foundering ship onto a reef of the uninhabited archipelago which became known as Bermuda, saving the 150 passengers and crew aboard. Among these were the newly appointed governor, future Governor Sir George.It, Sir Thomas Gates, Vice Admiral Christopher Newport, and future authors William Strachey and Samuel Jordan, as well as John Rolfe, who would later marry Pocahontas. The fate of the Sea Venture was unknown until the following year. The rest of the fleet sailed on to Jamestown, delivering hundreds of additional colonists. They had little in the way of food, supplies, or leaders, all of which had been principally carried on the Sea Venture. Samuel Argall, the captain of one of the other ships, delivered his passengers and what supplies he had, and hurried back to England to advise of the dire situation at Jamestown. In the meantime, the lack of food and supplies under general Indian blockade on the settlement's ability to hunt, forage, and claim farmland into the interior, combined with the arrival of additional colonists, weak leadership, and several other factors to cause death of over 80% of the 500 colonists at Jamestown in the subsequent year. This period between the fall of 1609 and the spring of 1610 became known as Starving Time. and indelibly shaped the community into the remainder of the 17th century as it strove to become more self-sufficient, chose a mixed use of crop, and caused the survivors and subsequent colonists to seek interlocking strategic points along the coasts to control Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, the survivors on Bermuda used salvaged parts of the shipwreck and native materials to build two new, smaller ships, the Deliverance and Patience. Most set sail for Jamestown 10 months later, leaving several men to establish possession of Bermuda. It would remain permanently settled, and Virginia's boundaries were extended in 1612 to include Bermuda. In 1615, Bermuda, also known as the Somers Isles, was transferred to a new company formed by the same shareholders, the Somers Isles Company, which oversaw it until 1684, when the Crown revoked the company's charter. Bermuda and Virginia continued to maintain close links, although there was no possibility of Bermuda joining Virginia and the other mainland colonies in the 1776 rebellion, and Bermuda remains part of the United Kingdom. Bermudians settled in North America in large numbers in the 17th and 18th centuries, and many places on the continent are named for the archipelago. John Rolfe and tobacco. Among the colonists who survived the shipwreck of the Sea Venture at Bermuda and sailed to Virginia was John Rolfe. At Bermuda Hundred, he cultivated and exported several non-native strains of tobacco, providing the proprietary colony with a crucial cash crop to export. Bermuda Hundred became a major shipping point for hogsheads of tobacco grown on plantations nearby. Rolfe became wealthy, and lived at Bermuda Hundred for a time. He is believed to have been living at a plantation at or near Bermuda Hundred at the time of the Great Indian Massacre of 1622, which, along the murdering of much of the colony's population, destroyed Henricus and the Falling Creek ironworks upstream on the James River. Although records indicate that he died in 1622, it is not known if he was a victim of the widespread coordinated attacks of the Powhatan Confederacy, which committed the murder of 1/3 of the colonists in several days, or if he died by other means. Early colonial period. With the subsequent victories in the Anglo-Powhatan Wars and other Indian campaigns, the Bermuda Hundred was able to expand and develop. The area at first was a combined settlement of a few mid-sized plantations, several smaller-sized farms, and the small port town which shipped the produce and needs. For most of the remaining 2/3 of the century, this mixed-use economy marked the Bermuda Hundred, thereby helping the community to grow. In turn, slowly the population recovered from the Indian attacks, and although outbreaks of Indian diseases continued to occur, new colonists arrived to keep the colony and Bermuda Hundred growing. However, starting in the second half of the 17th century and gaining momentum, a huge growth in demand, first in sugar and then in tobacco, occurred, causing the countryside to slowly change crops despite earlier colonial policy. Additionally, the Indians were pushed back in several campaigns, allowing for the expansion in size of the plantation, and another growth of population which put additional pressures on land and small farms. Slowly, over the remaining century and into the early 18th century, the farms turned to the valuable but land-depleting sugar and tobacco crops. As the soil depleted, requiring more and more land, large numbers of slaves were brought in to work the mortgaged land cheaply, thereby creating in an economy of capital centralization. Consequently, most of the smaller surrounding yeoman farms were absorbed into the plantations, their inhabitants falling into dependency to the planter class, turning to the town, or moving westward for cheaper land. Later colonial period. With this growth and evolving economy, the port and town also experienced expansion. Ironically, while originally serving both as a local tidewater port and an ocean-going port, as the cash crops pushed out the local consumption crops, thereby reducing the number of farms, and more slaves caused an increase in acreage and corresponding decrease in the number of plantations. The shippers required larger boats to carry the produce. Simultaneously, the growth in farmland starting increasing sailed downriver into the port. Thus, as the port began silting up, it was only maintained by dredging, which required additional costs on the shippers already competing for capital to build larger boats. Nonetheless, despite this increased competition, the port retained a good number of merchants devoted to the tidewater trade and import and export trade with the Great Britain and Ireland. Additionally, its shippers served in transporting and offloading the continually growing numbers of settlers migrating from other parts of the empire, particularly the United Kingdom and Ireland, into the colonies. Most of these migrants went on to settle further westward of the tidewater, later into the Piedmont, and finally into the Great Wagon Road and the Wilderness Road, which led them further west. The combination of import and export trade, human transportation, slave shipping, and the consequent requirements in parts and repair to maintain this small fleet resulted in a flourishing merchant community and an increase in the town's population. By the time of independence, the area had long ceased being the mixed economy of the 17th century and turned into becoming slow, easygoing and peaceful area of a few rich plantations and a slowly declining port. Several of the original colonial families remained, but had become a minority as indentured servants from Ireland, England, and Scotland arrived. Intermingled with the original colonists, new settlers replaced those old families who left west, and finally large numbers of black indentured servants and then slaves pushed out most of the original middling and working settler classes. French and Indian War and pre-Revolutionary War period. By the 1760s, the threat of Indian violence and economic deprivation in the Tidewater region, including the Bermuda Hundreds, had dissipated as a result of victory and integration between the colony and the British Empire. Despite restrictions on trading with other parts colonies, the Tidewater had full participation in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and many of its families were educated there. The merchant firms had developed deep and lasting relationships with other firms in the empire, and cash was readily available for capital improvement. The old colonial planters had developed into a strong aristocracy noted for supporting additional colonial expansion westward. Indeed, many of the frontier families had come from older colonial settlers originally from the Tidewater region and places like the Bermuda Hundreds. Many of the Tidewater's colonial aristocracy's junior members and cadet branches had moved westward and played leading roles in establishing new settlements and networks, thereby keeping the unity of colonial society. Thus, an economic, social, and political expansion had developed in which the Tidewater aristocracy played a key role in integrating the frontier with the Tidewater and, henceforth, with the larger British Empire. Indeed, many of the frontier families had come from older colonial settlers originally from the Tidewater region and places like the Bermuda Hundreds. Many of the Tidewater's colonial junior members and cadet branches had moved westward and played leading roles in establishing new settlements and networks, thereby keeping the unity of colonial society. Thus, the massive eruption of Indian violence and full-scale war on the frontier affected the Tidewater keenly despite not being directly attacked. The genocide of large numbers of the frontier families, the desperate battles in the forests, and sieges of the settler forts, recalled the days of the older Tidewater Indian Wars, which had almost destroyed the colony entirely. Now the battles and losses were even larger. The threat of a full-scale collapse of the frontier and the arrival of huge Franco-Indian armies presaged notions of annihilation. Consequently, with the outbreak of massive Indian wars on the frontiers and the involvement of large French armies, the Bermuda Hundreds was notably involved in supplying the arms, men, officers, and materials for the war effort. The war resulted in a severe check on the migration westward of new British settlers as well as colonial natives from the Hundreds. The horror of the losses gave pause to further expansion. More importantly, the royal government had broken its obligations toward settlers, and thus with the Tidewater aristocracy when it refused to honor recent frontier treaties with the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation was the result of secret negotiation between the royal government and Indian tribes by which the frontier settlers were deprived of the land and property, and any further expansion westward of British colonies was permanently halted. Economically, socially, and politically, the War, Peace Treaty and Proclamation was decisive in changing the life of the Bermuda Hundreds. Indeed, it was a major check on the continued evolution of the socio-economic life of the area. Previously, the change from a mixed economy featured by small farmers and shippers to a commercial economy of planters and merchants had only occurred without widespread social upheaval through the growth of new opportunities westward. Land pressure was relieved. Smaller yeoman farmers were able to maintain their existence by providing for the larger Tidewater region as well as the frontier. Merchants were prosperous from supporting both, and the planter class maintained its wealth and position. However, the proclamation and halt to further expansion threatened this existence. More importantly, such perfidy by their own government caused a political upheaval in the hundreds as middle-class locals and those frontier families being agitating against the presumed treason of the crown. Consequently, the planter classes debated how best to respond. Despite this continual economic growth and the increasing numbers of colonists arriving in the port, the consequence of a slave economy and globalism began to become apparent. Starting in the first quarter of the 18th century, the population of the colonial hundreds peaked. Slowly, a combination of capitalist centralizing movements created by Britain's global empire and the use of slavery caused an actual reduction in the numbers of British colonists in the hundreds as the middling level of planters, farmers, merchants, and arts and craftsmen were driven out or turned westward for better opportunities. At first, they were replaced by indentured servants, and then as slavery became all-powerful, they were replaced by cheap black slaves, thereby causing further pressures on the remaining colonial working classes to move elsewhere. Nonetheless, the area maintained a slight British colonial majority despite the large numbers of slaves until just prior to the Revolutionary period. Thus, by the time of independence, the area had long ceased being the mixed economy of the 17th century and had become interdependent with the wider British Empire. Rather than a mixed local economy, it was integrated with the much larger Virginia colony, much of the remaining American colonies, and yet was still dependent upon Great Britain both socially, politically, and even economically. For the Bermuda Hundreds, the majority of the remaining planters and especially what remained of the yeomen and town folk, the answer was clear: secession from the British Empire and the declaration of independence despite whatever economic losses might occur. The French and Indian War had proven to become a decisively changing event in the direction of the colony. Revolutionary War period. Therefore, from 1750 to 1780 as a result of war on the frontier, war with independence, continual war with the Indians after independence, the loss of population was temporarily halted while the commercial activity and income producing of cash crops was disrupted. Meanwhile, the Bermuda Hundreds had turned into becoming a slow, easygoing and peaceful area of a few rich plantations and a slowly declining port. Several of the original colonial families remained, but had become a minority as indentured servants from Ireland, England, and Scotland arrived. Intermingled with the original colonists, new settlers replaced those old families who left west, and finally large numbers of black indentured servants and then slaves pushed out much of the original middling and working settler classes. Nonetheless, many of those original colonial families which remained maintained a grip on life in the hundreds, despite the ties to Great Britain and Ireland within America, but outside of the Bermuda Hundreds and larger tidewater region. The colonial planters, yeoman farmers, merchant families, and ship owners were part of a larger social, political and economic network which they were loyal to. As a result of independence, the large numbers of Americans which had begun increasing as a result of the backlog from moving westward joined the war effort. Bermuda Hundred planter families supplied officers in the Virginia and Continental Army. At first, no major British forces managed to invade the region. Nonetheless, British fleet operations succeeded in making landing raids throughout the Bermuda Hundreds, lighting afire numerous houses presumed owned by patriots. Although most fought for Americans, there were several who fought for the Loyalists and as a result had their own plantations destroyed. These devastating but minor engagements were soon changed with the arrival of a combined British fleet and army operation under General Charles Cornwallis, 1st Marquis Cornwallis, whose grand strategy of subduing the Americans was first set back in the southern states, when his armies were defeated at Kings Mountain, only a day's march from Cornwallis and his army, and then his own army at the decisively defeated at Cowpens. With the southern campaign checked, Cornwallis received dispatches in Wilmington, North Carolina, informing him that another British army under Generals William Phillips and Benedict Arnold had been sent to Virginia. Believing that North Carolina could not be subdued unless its supply lines from Virginia were cut, he decided to join forces with Phillips, and since his army was still strong enough to strike directly into Virginia's tidewater and the heart of the Patriot resistance. In March 1781, in response to the threat posed by Arnold and Phillips, General Washington had dispatched Marquis de Lafayette to defend Virginia. The young Frenchman had 3,200 men at his command, but British troops in the state now totaled 7,200, and they soon quickly brushed aside the militia of the Bermuda Hundreds. Lafayette skirmished with Cornwallis, avoiding a decisive battle while gathering reinforcements. It was during this period that Cornwallis received orders from Clinton to choose a position on the Virginia Peninsula, referred to in contemporary letters as the Williamsburg Neck, and construct a fortified naval post to shelter ships of the line. However, by marching down the tidewater and eventually occupying the Bermuda Hundreds in complying with this order, Cornwallis put himself in a position to become trapped. Indeed, as a result of the rapidity and secrecy of movement by General George Washington from New York City, New York, and the arrival of the French fleet under the Comte de Grasse, the combined French-American army, Cornwallis found himself cut off. After the Royal Navy fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves was defeated by the French at the Battle of the Chesapeake, and the French siege train arrived from Newport, Rhode Island, to surround him in the Hundreds, his Cornwallis's position became untenable. He surrendered to General Washington and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, on the 19th of October 1781. Cornwallis, apparently not wanting to face Washington, claimed to be ill on the day of the surrender, and sent Brigadier General Charles O'Hara in his place to surrender his sword formally. Washington had his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, accept Cornwallis's sword.